Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. This is John Wayne Gacy. He was born on March 17th, 1942. He was an American serial killer and sex offender who raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys in Norwood Park Township, near Chicago, Illinois. Here are some facts about John Gacy. John Gacy was the second of 3 children and only son. John was close to his mother and 2 sisters, but had a difficult relationship with his alcoholic father, who was verbally and physically abusive to his family. His mother tried to shield her son from his father's abuse, which resulted in accusations that he was a sissy and a mama's boy who would probably grow up queer. On one occasion, Gacy's father whipped him after he and another boy were caught sexually fondling a young girl. The same year, a family friend began to occasionally molest John. John was an overweight and unathletic child. Because of a heart condition, he was told to avoid sports. In the 4th grade, Gacy began to experience blackouts. He was also hospitalized for a burst appendix. Gacy later estimated that between the ages of 14 and 18, he had spent almost a year in hospital. He attributed the decline of his grades to missing school. Gacy's medical condition was never conclusively diagnosed. His father accused his son of faking. In 1960, at age 18, John became involved in politics, working as an assistant precinct captain for a local Democratic Party candidate. This made his father criticize him even more and called him a patsy. The same year, John's father bought him a car. He kept the vehicle's title in his own name until John paid for it, which took several years. His father would take the keys if John did not do as he said. In April 1962, John purchased an extra set of keys. In response, his father removed the distributor cap, keeping the part for 3 days. Hours after his father replaced the cap, John left home and drove to Las Vegas, Nevada, with $136 to his name, hoping he could live with a cousin. Gacy worked in the Las Vegas ambulance service before being transferred to Palm Mortuary. He worked as a mortuary attendant for 3 months. He slept on a cot behind the embalming room. One evening, while alone, he clambered into the coffin of a teenage boy, embracing and caressing the body before experiencing a sense of shock. This experience made John move back home. John did not graduate high school, but was able to enroll at Northwestern Business College. He graduated in 1963 and took a management trainee position with the Nunn-Bush Shoe Company. In 1964, the company transferred him to Springfield, Illinois, to work as a salesman, and eventually promoted him to department manager. While working, John and a coworker named Marilyn Myers began dating. Gacy and Myers married in September 1964. That same year, he had his second homosexual experience. Shortly after their marriage, Marilyn's father purchased 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken (KFC) restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. The couple moved there so Gacy could manage the restaurants, with the understanding that they would move into Marilyn's parents' former home. Gacy would receive $15,000 per year, the equivalent of about $152,600 as of 2025, plus a share of the restaurant's profits. Gacy opened a club in his basement where his employees could drink alcohol and play pool. Although Gacy employed teenagers of both sexes, he socialized only with the males. Gacy gave many of them alcohol before he made sexual advances. If they rebuffed him, he would claim his advances were jokes or a test of morals. Gacy joined the local JC's chapter, being there from 12 and 14-hour days. At meetings, Gacy often provided fried chicken and insisted on being called Colonel. He and other Waterloo JCs were also deeply involved in drug abuse, pornography, prostitution, and wife swapping. The JCs held him in high regard for his fundraising work, and in 1967, he was named Outstanding Vice President of the Waterloo JCs and served on the board of directors. During this time, Gacy S. assaulted 15-year-old Donald Voorhees Jr., the son of Donald Edwin Voorhees, a local politician and fellow JC. Gacy lured Donald Jr. to his house, promising to show him heterosexual stag films regularly played at JC events. Gacy gave Voorhees large amounts of alcohol, allowed him to watch a stag movie, then persuaded him to engage in mutual oral sex. Gacy told Donald Jr.,
"You have to have sex with a man before you start having sex with women."
Over the next several months, Gacy abused several other youths, including one whom he encouraged to have sex with his own wife before blackmailing him into performing oral sex on him. Gacy also tricked several teenagers into believing he was commissioned to conduct homosexual experiments for scientific research, and paid them up to $50 each. In March 1968, Donald Jr. could not take it anymore and told his father that Gacy had sexually assaulted him. Donald Sr. immediately informed the police, who arrested Gacy and charged him with performing oral sodomy on Donald Jr. and the attempted assault of 16-year-old Edward Lynch. Gacy vehemently denied the charges and demanded to take a polygraph test, which was indicative of deception. Gacy publicly denied any wrongdoing and insisted the charges were politically motivated. Gacy was very upset and went to one of his employees, 18-year-old Russell Schroeder, and promised him $300 if he physically assaulted Voorhees in an effort to discourage the boy from testifying in court. Schroeder lured Voorhees to an isolated park, sprayed mace in his eyes, then beat him. Voorhees escaped and reported Schroeder's actions to police. The police caught Schroeder and arrested him the next day. He initially denied involvement, but soon confessed to assaulting Voorhees, telling the police that he had done so at Gacy's request. Police wasted no time to arrest Gacy and charged him with hiring Schroeder to assault and intimidate Voorhees. Gacy was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation at the Psychiatric Hospital of the University of Iowa. 2 doctors concluded that Gacy had an antisocial personality disorder and that his behavior pattern was likely to be repeated. The doctors concluded Gacy was mentally competent to stand trial. On November 7, 1968, Gacy pleaded guilty to 1 count of sodomy in relation to Voorhees, but not guilty to the charges related to other youths. Gacy was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in prison. That same day, Gacy's wife filed for divorce, requesting she be awarded the couple's home and property, sole custody of their 2 children, and alimony. The court ruled in her favor, and the divorce was finalized on September 18, 1969. Gacy never saw his first wife or children again. After serving 18 months in prison of his 10-year sentence, Gacy was granted probation on June 18, 1970. His probation included a nightly curfew and that Gacy relocate to Chicago to live with his mother. 2 years later, Gacy was charged again with sexually assault on a teenage boy who claimed that Gacy lured him into his car and attempted to force the boy into sex. The court dismissed this complaint when the boy failed to appear. Gacy had another case, from a boy who also had the charges dropped because of blackmail. Gacy's parole ended on October 18, 1971. And a month later, the records of Gacy's criminal convictions in Iowa were sealed. Gacy worked as a cook and bought a ranch-style house, with financial assistance from his mother. Gacy was active in his local community. He willingly loaned his construction tools and plowed snow for neighbors free of charge. From 1974 to 1978, he hosted themed annual summer parties. These events were attended by up to 400 people, including politicians and business associates. Gacy quit his job as a cook and started his own construction business called PDM Contractors for painting, decorating, and maintenance. By 1975, PDM was expanding rapidly, and Gacy was working up to 16 hours per day. He became a supervisor for PE Systems, a firm specializing in the remodeling of drugstores. Between PE Systems and PDM, Gacy worked on up to 4 projects and frequently traveled to other states. PDM's annual revenue was over $200,000. Gacy also had a membership at a local moose club. That's when he became aware of a Jolly Joker clown club, whose members regularly performed at fundraising events and parades, in addition to voluntarily entertaining hospitalized children. Gacy joined the Clown Club and created his own characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, devising his own makeup and costumes. He described Pogo as a happy clown, whereas Patches was a more serious. Gacy said that acting as a clown allowed him to regress into childhood. He performed as both Pogo and Patches at numerous local parties, political functions, charitable events, and children's hospitals. Gacy's clowning around as a voluntary public service clown throughout the years of his murders led to him being known as the Killer Clown. Most of PDM's workforce consisted of high school students and young men. Gacy would often proposition his workers for sex or insist on sexual favors in return for lending his vehicles, financial assistance, or promotions. Gacy also claimed to own guns, once telling an employee, "Do you know how easy it would be to get one of my guns and kill you? And how easy it would be to get rid of the body?" Gacy would try to hurt the teen boys one after another. Although they didn't tell on him, a few of the boys didn't take his crap. Gacy hired 15-year-old Anthony Antonucci. One evening, he went to Antonucci's home, knowing he had an injured foot. The two drank a bottle of wine, then watched a heterosexual stag film. Then Gacy wrestled Antonucci to the floor and cuffed his hands behind his back. One cuff was loose, and Antonucci freed his arm while Gacy was out of the room. When Gacy returned, Antonucci, a high school wrestler, grappled with him, obtained the key, and cuffed Gacy's hands behind his back. Gacy threatened Antonucci, then calmed down and promised to leave if he was freed. Antonucci agreed, and Gacy left. Antonucci continued working for PDM for 9 months after this incident, and Gacy made no further attempts to assault him. Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys, 26 of them, he buried in the crawl space of his house. His victims included people he knew and random individuals he lured from Chicago's Greyhound bus station, or off the streets with the promise of a job with PDM. He would offer drinks, drugs, or money for sex. Some victims were grabbed by force, others were conned into believing Gacy, who often carried a sheriff's badge and had red spotlights on his black Oldsmobile, was a policeman. Gacy's would lure the youth to his home with drink, drugs, or by making them trust him. He would then bring out his handcuffs to show a magic trick, sometimes as part of a clowning routine. Gacy proceeded with rape and torture before forcing the victim to fellate him. Gacy then inflicted acts of torture, including burning with cigars, and acts he said were inspired by the Houston mass murders. He would also partly drown them in the bathtub before repeatedly reviving them. Gacy would usually murder his victims by placing a rope around their neck and progressively tightening it with a hammer handle. He referred to this as the rope trick, frequently informing his victim, "This is the last trick." The victim convulsed for an hour or two before dying, although several victims died by asphyxiation from cloth gags stuffed deep in their throats. All except 2 victims were murdered between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Gacy usually stored the victims' corpses under his bed for up to 24 hours before burying them in the crawl space, where he periodically poured quicklime to hasten decomposition. He embalmed some in the garage prior to burial. On January 3, 1972, Gacy drove to the Civic Center in the early morning to view a display of ice sculptures. He met a 16-year-old boy named Timothy Jack McCoy at Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal. McCoy was on his way to his father's home in Omaha, Nebraska, and told Gacy his bus was not going to be there until noon. Gacy took McCoy on a sightseeing tour of Chicago and then drove him to his house, telling McCoy that he could spend the night and he'll take him back in time to catch the bus. Gacy said early that morning he woke up and McCoy was standing in his bedroom doorway holding a knife. So he jumped from his bed, and when McCoy raised both arms, he accidentally cut Gacy's forearm, so Gacy took the knife and banged his head against the bedroom wall. Gacy then grabbed McCoy, wrestled him to the floor, and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest. Gacy claimed he washed the knife in his bathroom, then went to his kitchen to make breakfast. He set the table for 2. After that, Gacy walked back into the room to wake McCoy up while still holding the knife. Gacy said immediately after killing McCoy, he felt totally drained, yet noted that listening to the gurgulations and gasping, he had experienced a mind-numbing orgasm. He added, "That's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill." On the afternoon of December 11th, 1978, Gacy visited the Nissan pharmacy in Des Plaines to discuss a potential remodeling deal with the store owner, while he was within earshot of 15-year-old part-time employee Robert Peast. Gacy intentionally mentioned his firm often hired teenage boys at a starting wage of $5 per hour, almost double the pay Peast earned at the pharmacy. Peast told his mother that some contractor wanted to talk to him about a job. Then he left the store at 9 p.m. and never returned. When Peast did not return, his family filed a missing person report with the Des Plaines police. The store owner told police that Gacy was the contractor Peast had most likely left the store with. Des Plaines police checked Gacy's criminal background, and it revealed that Gacy had an outstanding battery charge in Chicago and had been imprisoned in Iowa for the sodomy of a 15-year-old boy. Kozenchak, the detective investigating the case, and two Des Plaines police officers visited Gacy at his home the following evening to question him about Peast. Gacy promised to come to the station later that evening to make a statement, saying he couldn't at that moment because his uncle had just died. When asked how soon he could come to the police station, he responded, "You guys are very rude. Don't you have any respect for the dead?" They then suspected Gacy might be holding Peast at his home. Des Plaines police obtained a search warrant. Inside the house, they found several suspicious items, including several police badges, a starting pistol, a syringe and hypodermic needle, handcuffs, books about homosexuality and pederasty, pornographic films, capsules of amyl nitrite, a dildo, a 2x4 with 2 holes drilled into each end, bottles of Valium and atropine, and several driver's licenses. The Des Plaines police also confiscated Gacy's Oldsmobile and other PDM work vehicles. A surveillance team was set up to monitor Gacy as the investigation continued. Gacy was becoming affable with the surveillance detectives, regularly inviting them to join him for meals in restaurants and occasionally for drinks in bars or at his home. One evening, when two detectives decided to eat with him, Gacy told them, "You know, clowns can get away with murder." After a while, Gacy was beginning to display signs of strain from the constant surveillance. He was unshaven, looked tired and anxious, and was drinking heavily. Gacy decided that he would go to his lawyer's office to prepare a $750,000 civil suit against the Des Plaines police, demanding that they cease. On December 20th, Gacy drove to his lawyer's office in Park Ridge to attend a scheduled meeting about the progress of his civil suit. Gacy appeared anxious and disheveled, and immediately asked for an alcoholic drink of Seagram's whiskey. Gacy then proceeded to give a rambling confession that ran into the early hours of the following morning. He began by stating he had been the judge, jury, and executioner of many, many people, and that he now wanted to be the same for himself. He stated he had murdered at least 30 victims, most of whom he had buried in his crawlspace, and had disposed of 5 other bodies in the Des Plaines River. Gacy dismissed his victims as male prostitutes, hustlers, and liars, adding he sometimes awoke to find dead, strangled kids with their hands cuffed behind their back. He had buried their bodies in his crawlspace at his house. After passing out from drinking that morning, his lawyer tried to get him an evaluation, but Gacy said he didn't have time for that. After leaving his lawyer's office, Gacy drove to a gas station, where he handed a small bag of cannabis to the attendant, who immediately handed the bag to the surveillance officers, adding that Gacy had told him, "The end is coming, for me. These guys are going to kill me." Gacy then drove to the home of a fellow contractor and friend. Gacy hugged him before bursting into tears and saying, "I've been a bad boy. I killed 30 people, give or take a few." The surveillance officers noted he was holding a rosary to his chin, praying while he drove along the expressway. Gacy drove around to different locations that morning while police worked on their second search warrant, specifically to search for Peast's body in the crawl space. The surveillance detectives saw Gacy's erratic behavior and thought he might commit suicide. So the police decided to arrest him on a charge of possession and distribution of cannabis in order to hold him in custody. After police informed Gacy they were going to search his crawl space for the body of Peast, Gacy said, that he did not kill Piest, but confessed to killing a young man in self-defense whose body was buried under his garage. The police and evidence technicians drove to Gacy's home. They found Gacy had unplugged his sump pump and flooded the crawl space with water, so they replaced the plug and waited for the water to drain. A evidence technician crawled into a 28 by 38 foot, 8.5 meters by 11.6 meters, crawl space and began digging. Within minutes, he uncovered putrefied flesh and a human arm bone. The detective shouted to the investigators that they could charge Gacy with murder, adding, "I think this place is full of kids." After the police told Gacy they found human remains in his crawl space and that he would now face murder charges, Gacy told officers he wanted to clear the air. In the presence of his lawyers, Gacy provided a formal statement in which he confessed to murdering approximately 30 young males, all of whom he claimed had entered his house willingly. Accompanied by police, his lawyers, and his older sister, Gacy was driven to the I-55 bridge to show where he had thrown 5 or more of the victims into the river. Gacy was then taken to his house and had to mark his garage floor with orange spray paint to show where he had buried the victims. Gacy also drew a rough diagram of his basement to indicate where their bodies were buried. 26 bodies were unearthed from Gacy's crawl space over the next week. 3 others were also unearthed elsewhere on his property. As the flooring and walls of the property were dismantled, additional evidence, including the rib cage of another victim. Before Gacy's trial, he underwent a variety of psychological tests to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. Gacy attempted to convince the doctors that he had multiple personality disorder. He claimed to have 4 personalities: the hardworking, civic-minded contractor, the clown, the active politician, and a policeman called Jack Hanley, whom he referred to as Bad Jack. His lawyers opted to have Gacy plead not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecutors argued that Gacy was sane and in full control of his actions. They also were able to get several witnesses to testify to his premeditation and the efforts he took to escape detection. On March 11th, final arguments by both prosecution and defense attorneys began. Prosecuting outlined Gacy's history of abusing youths, referring to Gacy as the worst of all murderers. The prosecutor said, "John Gacy has accounted for more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes. I tremble when thinking about just how close he came to getting away with it all." The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 50 minutes, and Gacy was found guilty of 33 charges of murder. He was also found guilty of sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child. 33 murders was the most for which any person in U.S. history had been convicted at the time of his conviction. The jury then deliberated for more than 2 hours before sentencing Gacy to death for each murder committed. His execution was set for June 2nd, 1980. Gacy was transferred to the Menard Correctional Center, where he remained on death row for 14 years. Gacy tried to appeal the decision to be executed, but the U.S. Supreme Court denied Gacy's final appeal in October 1993 and formally set an execution date for May 10th. On the morning of May 9th, 1994, Gacy was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family. For his last meal, Gacy ordered a bucket of KFC, French fries, a dozen fried shrimp, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. There was over 1,000 people gathered outside the correctional center. The majority were in favor of the execution. His final statement to his lawyer before his execution was that killing him would not compensate for the loss of others, and that the state was murdering him. His final spoken words were reported to be, "Kiss my ass." At 12:40 a.m., the procedure to administer the lethal injection began. The IV clogged unexpectedly, and the execution team had to replace and begin the execution. The entire procedure took 18 minutes. Anesthesiologists blamed the problem on the prison officials' inexperience at conducting an execution. This error apparently led to Illinois adopting an alternative method of lethal injection. One prosecutor at Gacy's trial said at least he got a much easier death than any of his victims. After Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, his brain was removed and given to Helen Morrison, an American forensic psychiatrist, writer, and profiler who has interviewed Gacy and other serial killers in an attempt to isolate common personality traits of violent sociopaths. Gacy was cremated, and the whereabouts of his ashes remain undisclosed. Thanks again for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe.